iconic moments of the civil rights movement. What do you see? Maybe the march from Selma to Montgomery, lunch counter sit-ins, or bus boycotts across the country. But what about this? Or this? What happened in the waters of St. Augustine, Florida, was one of the most critical campaigns in the movement to desegregate the U.S.
You should have just streamed it? What, the Borat movie?
I still have an eerie feeling when I'm in St. Augustine.
They did not like that idea of sharing water. The idea that something that touched us is going to touch them.
American beaches and pools have long been flashpoints of racial conflict in the U.S. Historically, many cities prohibited Black people from stepping into public waters.
Leisure is primarily a tool of capitalism. Leisure is also a tool of white supremacy, and it articulates power in society in a certain way: who has it, who does not, who has the right to wield it, and oftentimes this plays out in public spaces.
In the North and South, white people fiercely oppose the integration of these spaces. In some cases, separate pools and beaches for Black Americans were established, but they were often small, far away, and dangerous. In New Orleans, for example, the city's designated Black beach was an area grossly polluted with sewage from nearby fishing camps. That unequal access to recreation is how wait-ins were born. Wait-ins were a spin on the nonviolent lunch counter sit-ins that spread quickly across the country in the 1950s and 60s. But instead of demanding access to businesses, waiting in to beaches and pools demanded access to leisure.
On one hand, it's to pronounce a sense of you see us, and you must sort of deal with us when you see us. The other aspect or end of a wait-in is to invoke some sense of reaction. So since you're unwanted either by law or by social behaviors, people are going to react to your presence.
Beaches became an important site for civil disobedience campaigns in the 1950s and early 60s. From the shores of Biloxi to Chicago to Fort Lauderdale, protesters gathered to demand equal access to city waters. By the time wait-ins were organized in St. Augustine, a local movement to end racial discrimination was already making headlines. Soon, the campaign to desegregate these waters became the tipping point in a campaign to desegregate the entire nation. The movement in St. Augustine started with a local dentist and NAACP Youth Council advisor named Robert Haling. Beginning in 1963, Haling mobilized youth in St. Augustine to take part in civil rights sit-ins, marches, and boycotts.
I feel it is incumbent upon the city officials to make St. Augustine a glaring example of democracy.
React harder? Okay, Blake Star. I'm just going to remind everyone, because sometimes we forget, or maybe we just don't put these two pieces together, that people are still alive who protested during these wait-ins or during these public demonstrations. They're still alive. Jim Crow laws aren't that far out from our past. They weren't that long ago. And we are still dealing with the ramifications of segregated societies still to this day. We are still dealing with institutional racism to this day. The remnants of these segregation laws are still ever present today. And I think that we forget that whenever we are making these counter arguments, or white people are making this counter argument of reverse white racism, which absolutely isn't a thing. Whenever we're looking at back in retrospect, we are observing just how hard of a fight, of an uphill battle it was to just have equal access to a city's resources or to recreation. So whenever you hear any right-winger say racism ended whenever the Civil Rights Act was enacted, that's a lie. That is a lie. Just because it was on paper that racism or discrimination was no longer legal doesn't mean that this same behavior, right? This same espoused understanding of segregation did not stay with these individuals who were on the better side of these Jim Crow laws, who had more advantages, who had the privilege to go to better school, who had better access to better resources. And this is something that I think that we tend to forget, that this wasn't that long ago. In fact, most of our grandparents lived through this time where it was normal. It was normal to be segregated. So it is going to take a little bit more integration, and it is an intergenerational battle where the more integrated we become and the more we spend time in a diverse society, the less likely we will see racism unfold in the way that it has in years past. But I just wanted to stop and react a little bit because somebody had made that request. 400 years damn feels like yesterday. This was not 400 years ago. Jim Crow was not 400 years ago. Don't conflate Jim Crow with slavery. It's still an uphill battle for the African American communities at large. Again, your grandparents, depending on how old you are, I don't know, if you're my age, then your grandparents lived through Jim Crow. Integration is how different societies get along. Racist conservatives want to think systemic racism doesn't exist. Of course they do, because it's an inconvenience. It's an inconvenience to them. I am not 100. Okay, my apologies. My apologies. Whenever we look at the cultural makeup of a metropolitan area or a region, and we see heterogeneity and integration, there are less instances of racism, right? For the most part, racism tends to fester in these homogenous societies where there is less diversity and there is more segregation. And this is precisely the problem. And this is why I say it will take a few generations of integration to become normal, to start to see racism become less and less present in society. But again, that can be an uphill battle too. Whenever we are looking at some of these areas, these regions, or these cities, metropolitan areas, whatever you want to call them, they are on various levels of scale here. But it's there's empirical evidence that we can look at if we need to. But the more integrated a society is, it's true, the less racism there tends to be in the form of hate crimes and reported incidents of discrimination. It's really hard, though, whenever you're up against institutionally backed discrimination and institutionally backed racism and systemic racism, whenever even if you have a really diverse community, if you still have higher rates of police brutality that disproportionately harm Black and brown men, then that is still an issue that a more diverse society doesn't necessarily control for. So yes, there are multiple pronged approaches to try to eliminate the existence of racism, and it doesn't just stop with an integrated society, which is why we have to do our part to make sure that we are looking to see changes in the form of police reform and other ways of finding a way to completely dismantle these systems of oppressions at large, rebuild them so that we are covering all bases here. It's absolutely necessary that we do take a multi-pronged approach, in fact. How come they haven't colorized this footage yet? Sorry. Okay, sorry. All right, let's get back to it. What is this?
At work.
As the demonstrations picked up, so did violence against them. Hundreds of protesters were beaten and jailed. 4 teenagers who conducted a sit-in were ripped from their families and sent to reform school. The homes of activists were also under constant threat. A targeted shooting of Haling's home narrowly missed his pregnant wife and killed his dog.
So many houses were shot into. We knew that anytime we had lights on in the house at night, we were running the risk of our house being firebombed. So my brother and I still had to keep up with our studies. When darkness came, we would take turns going into that closet, closing the door to study. And we knew if we did not go into that particular area to study, we were going to either be shot or the house was going to be burned down.
The tempo of violence increased rapidly in St. Augustine. The Klan paraded in the streets, unmindful of the rain.
Ku Klux Klan rallies ramped up too. At one rally, Haling and 3 other activists were captured and brutally beaten. Later, Haling was the one convicted for assaulting the Klansmen after 5 minutes of deliberation by an all-white jury. He was later forced to resign as an aide to the NAACP after a grand jury accused him and other activists of being militant.
That we white people are going to rise up 140 million strong.
Haling and the other activists needed a new plan and new allies. Haling reached out to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a civil rights organization established by Martin Luther King Jr. At the time, King's main focus was to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Among other measures, the bill aimed to desegregate public places. But in the spring of '64, the bill had been held up by the Senate, stuck in a record-long filibuster. King knew heightened tensions back in St. Augustine made it a segregated superbomb, and believed high-profile acts of civil disobedience, like the ones Haling organized, could be the push needed to get the Civil Rights Act passed. King and several SCLC leaders shifted focus to St. Augustine and began a series of demonstrations that spring. With the SCLC's help, Haling's movement gained organizers, a financial boost, and high-profile supporters. Jackie Robinson, a black baseball star who pioneered integration of the sport, came to a St. Augustine rally. And Mary Peabody, the 72-year-old mother of the governor of Massachusetts, was jailed after a St. Augustine sit-in, which put the movement in national and international newspapers. Then, in a demonstration on June 11, 1964, King attempted to enter the restaurant at the Monson Motor Lodge, a St. Augustine hotel owned by this man, James Brock. King and 17 others were barred from entering and arrested. A week later, protesters shifted their focus to the swimming pool at the Monson Motor Lodge. By June 18th, 2 white protesters checked into the hotel. 5 black demonstrators were to be their guests in the pool that day. They drove up to the hotel, but they knew they couldn't go in the front door, so they found a way in through the hedges around the pool. As the group waded into the Monson swimming pool, other organizers, including a group of 16 rabbis invited by King, formed a prayer circle around the Monson to join in the civil rights demonstration. With the rabbis outside, King marching down the street with others, and the wade-in at the pool, the demonstration was designed to grab attention. At first, James Brock, the hotel owner, tried to use a cleaning pole to get the swimmers out. But when that didn't work, Brock tried something else. He came out with a bottle of hydrochloric acid, a corrosive pool cleaning chemical, and threw the acid toward the protesters in the pool to drive them out. Mimi Jones, one of the protesters in the pool that day, recalled her experience in a 2017 interview.
And all of a sudden, the water in front of my face started to bubble up like a volcanic eruption. I could barely breathe. It was entering my nose and my eyes. It was just very frightening and terrifying because I really didn't see him coming.
Soon after, a fully clothed police officer jumped into the pool
to arrest us, to usher us out of the pool, and there were other policemen there waiting for us, and carted us off to jail.
The goal of the wait-in was to make the news, and photographers captured every moment.
So again, whenever you hear anyone say, what about reverse racism? What about reverse racism? We are not, as white people, ever going to be in a position where we are actually victims of racism. We are historically the oppressor, all right? We belong to an identity that has been, by and large, the oppressor. That should bother you more than any kind of disrespects or uncomfortable situation that you might have had with somebody who is not white that makes you think that you have been targeted or you have been a victim of reverse racism if you've had an interpersonal experience that you thought was unfavorable to you, or if you feel that because of affirmative action, that meeting a quota to include non-white individuals somehow took away your right or your spot to a job or in a program at college or to even be enrolled or to be accepted into college. I have to tell you that this is the reason why you are never in a position to call on reverse racism as a real thing. It's not a real phenomenon. It's just the backlash from white people who have been living a life of privilege their entire life and have intergenerationally experienced privilege their entire life, feel as though they are losing sight of this privilege that they are not entitled to. They should not feel inclined to this entitlement, all right, but they do. And that is what you are experiencing as a white person. You are beginning to see a world that is more equitable, not even close to scratching the surface of true equity, but we are calling on different measures to ensure that we have a more free, fair, just, and equal system. And it is incredibly incremental. These changes are so marginal that African Americans and non-white individuals at large do not feel the benefit of these new laws, these new policies, these new plans of actions to bring about a more equal and just world. But it's interesting that you feel it because you see this being a true threat to you or your status or your false sense of superiority or whatever the case may be. So bear that in mind. Equality feels like oppression as an oppressor. Exactly. But something that you have to be incredibly mindful of is that it's really interesting that you tend to feel like your place in this world is a direct threat whenever there are so many people who are still on the bad end of an unjust world that have not been able to even feel the same kind of opportunities or have the option to seek the same level of opportunities because of the incrementalism that has gone into this new plan of action or this new way forward for a just and equal world, right? Think about that too. Next time you feel like, oh no, I really feel like I am oppressed, or maybe I am maybe I am just as marginalized as African Americans at this point. You're not. You still have a better shot. You still have a better shot in many cases to go to college, to get the job, to land the job. There is still a net benefit of white privilege in this country, and that is not up for debate.
Our whole foreign policy and everything else go to hell over this. Yesterday in the swimming pool in St. Augustine, they started pouring acid in the pool.
The very next day, after a 60-day filibuster, the U.S. Senate passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, making way for it to get signed into law by the president. As the nation waited for the bill to get signed, the St. Augustine wait-ins continued on the beaches. Day after day, dozens of black and white demonstrators showed up to the shore and were met with brutality from white supremacists.
We went to St. Augustine Beach, and then all of a sudden they started hitting us and just punching anybody who got in the way. And I was one of the ones who was punched. My nose was broken.
The violence peaked on June 25th, when 75 people peacefully entered the water. Highway patrol was sent in to keep the peace, but violence quickly broke out, and they arrested both black and white demonstrators.
Notice the speed at which the action develops and the need for officers to pursue the attackers.
The demonstrations continued. The fighting continued. The bullying continued. And it wasn't just about us and integrating that beach. We knew about the bigger picture.
Later that night, hundreds of white supremacists rallied in St. Augustine and attacked civil rights protesters on a march. The clash led to 19 black people being hospitalized, with many more injured.
On the night of June 25th, 1964, the fuse burned down and the racial bomb exploded.
But they tell me that I don't even have the right to fight to protect the white race.
A week later, on July 2nd, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed into law.
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed at the White House by President Johnson to back what he calls a turning point in history.
This moment was monumental, but in the years that followed, wait-ins continued. Cities used different strategies to keep their hold on segregation. For public beaches and pools, that meant many whites-only signs were simply replaced with private club signs and high fees to enter. And as white people started fleeing cities for the suburbs, local governments neglected many urban pools and eventually shut them down. As for St. Augustine, the passing of the Civil Rights Act didn't change the minds of white residents there either. In the years that followed, Dr. Haling left St. Augustine. He could no longer make a living in the city or feel safe there.
St. Augustine is still roughly the St. Augustine that I remember from the 60s.
U.S. beaches and pools remain battlegrounds today. In Pennsylvania, black and brown children were kicked out of their rented pool space because management feared it could change the complexion of the private club. In Texas, white residents called the police on black teens trying to enjoy the neighborhood pool. And in North Carolina, a white hotel employee called the police on a black family using the pool during their stay.
All of what happened in the 60s, is, you see some of it come back. It's like deja vu.
I asked you to leave politely. Simple as that.
And I heard this lady, she was like, what are all these black kids doing here? She's like, I'm scared they might do something to my child.
You're not having any prayer here. You're on private property, and I'm ordering you to leave this place here.
Hi everyone, thanks for watching this episode of Missing Chapter. If you want to know more about St. Augustine and the wait-ins, we have something special for you, the first ever Missing Chapter in podcast form. We dive deeper into Cynthia's experience as a local activist and speak to a protester who was at the Monson Motor Lodge pool. You can find a link to that podcast in the description below.
If only had the camera phones. I'm like, if they had camera phones in the 1960s, I honestly, could you imagine the Karens that would have been captured So, speaking of Karens, chat, it wasn't that long ago. I did the video about trying to make sense of how Karens exist. And as we've seen in contemporary times, it tends to be white women who call the cops on black kids who are entering public spaces who white women deem black kids as a threat, right? This is a really common occurrence, in fact. It's seemingly white women who are taking it upon themselves to act as this vigilante, as if there is a true threat right now with sharing space with non-white individuals. But it is the adverse effect that the presence of non-white individuals and what they do to a white woman, that is what we need to call into question. That is the way that racism has manifested in a new kind of way, right? Where it's under the guise of fear or uncertainty, where their safety is at risk in their minds, right? And that is because of the impact of segregation that was reimagined after Jim Crow laws became illegal, and there was new ways, like we saw in the video, where instead of saying whites only, there was they privatized their pools and they charged fees that did not allow black people or non-white people to enter. This was a barrier of entry to some of these common utilities or resources that did effectively keep these neighborhoods segregated. So Karens are a byproduct of these newly envisioned segregated societies where there was a need to have a workaround by way of white flight, by way of redlining, to continue on the legacy of segregation in a new kind of way, because it was now at this point illegal, right? So you think about how this has manifested in a way, and you still see this same kind of racism because of segregation, because we haven't integrated our neighborhoods, because a lot of these women who call the cops on black kids today did not grow up with black people in their gated communities. And this is how a fear of the unknown manifests today whenever a white woman is sharing public space with a non-white person, and it's with a non-white person, this is their response by and large. It is so popular that it's a meme on the internet. You can almost guarantee that if you see there's a caricature of a Karen. There is a caricature of a Karen. They have very similar tendencies across the board, no matter where they live. The one commonality, there is one common denominator that you can almost assume at this point, is that they grew up in a homogenous location in an all-white community, and that they did not have exposure to non-white people. They lived in a bubble, and they have a very limited understanding about non-white people. So whenever they see anyone who has similar material conditions as themselves, they call that into question. Whenever they see someone who is non-white enter spaces that they have not deemed deserving of sharing this white space, or this whites only space in contemporary times, they do act out, and it is under the guise of fear. But they ultimately do call the cops and put anyone who they think does not belong in direct risk or harm's way, whenever we know that there's an issue with police brutality, and non-white individuals are still targeted by and large disproportionately by the cops. So this is how we have a cycle here. This is how we see these institutions that tend to favor white people and tend to elevate the interests of white people or privilege white people are used by white people against non-white people, that leads to even further racial agitation in our everyday engagements. So yes, this is important to observe and to study the way that history is repeating itself right now. It's just taking a new approach. It's just a newly imagined approach of seeing racism. But it's still the same. There's a study that found that Americans, regardless of race, see black men as being older and larger than they really are. That is the effect in a racist society that has on your brain. Shit. Really? Did I say white people? I mean, whatever. If I did, who cares? White people are so sensitive. White people are so incredibly sensitive. It's the fact that like some Twitter online discourse is revolving around whether or not cracker is a derogatory term tells you all that you need to know about how sensitive white people are. It's embarrassing. Black girls are also seen as older too, which can lead to some terrifying shit. Do you think that's why? So do you think that's why more African American boys and girls are tried as adults if they are involved in something? They end up in the juvenile detention system. I mean, that makes sense. That makes sense whenever you think about how they are more likely to be charged as adults, even if they are minors, than their white counterparts. Again, just another way in which our criminal justice system is outright racism, blatantly racism. It's blatant racism. I think they have done studies on this. Imagine how sensitive white people would be if they actually had to live through racial trauma growing up. And again, white people are only reinforcing this false narrative of they're only reinforcing this false narrative of what they think is reverse racism, but only reinforcing they are reinforcing how privileged they are, and how they really are. I mean, the white fragility, say what you will about the white fragility book, but the concept of white fragility is absolutely real. Am I glitching? Am I buffering? Cracker is technically derogatory. It just isn't a slur. Like, to be derogatory, it just means to be demeaning. Slurs require societal power. True, I guess, like, from a pejorative standpoint, it can be problematic. But only if... I just feel like nobody is actually offended if they are called a cracker. Good now. I was just teasing about your repetition. Oh, okay. Oh, I was trying to make light of the fact that I said the way in which once again, insane numbers in states. Check the turnout as a percent of 2016 total. Yeah. Honestly, anybody who... You want to know how... If you want to spot a fucking racist, honestly, truly, if you want to spot a fucking racist, it is the person who tries to make it seem like they are hurts by being called a cracker. It just means that they are trying to further racial agitation. They are trying to make it seem like they are the victim, and this is indicative that they might be a little racist themselves. If somehow they find this word to be so hurtful, right? They find it to be so offensive, right? I would call into question why, right? And look for deeper meaning as to why this person is so offended, especially if their ideological perspectives tend to be viewed from a right-wing perspective, if you know what I'm saying. If they're a Republican, are we talking about the K word? No, we're talking about cracker, the word cracker. So yeah, if they are somehow both more inclined to support states' rights, if they are in support of the Confederacy, if they are a registered Republican, if they truly think in their minds that racism ended in 1964, but somehow they find it offensive to be called a cracker, I think that they might be racist. It's not that I think, they most likely are. Like, that's like a no-brainer, right? At this point, I would say it's almost a no-brainer. That's not a hot take. It's just a no-brainer.